The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the peaceful silence, ripping through the air like a storm on the horizon. Frank, an old man with a past darker than the night, stood between his daughter and a gang of ruthless bikers. His hand tightened around a fishing rod, but it wasn't the rod that made him dangerous. It was the memories of a soldier who had seen more bloodshed than any of them could ever imagine. "You think I'm just some old man?" Frank's voice rumbled, low and steady. "You have no idea what I've survived." The quiet waves lapped against the shore as the sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the small, modest home by the sea. The wind whispered through the long grass, carrying with it the scent of salt and seaweed, an aroma that reminded Frank of years spent on this very coastline. The air, warm but crisp, seemed to hold a promise of peace, of moments that would never be disturbed. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, the world was far from calm. It had a way of testing those who sought solace. Frank, a man in his 50s, weathered but strong, walked slowly toward the old wooden pier, his boots tapping against the worn planks with each step. His face, roughened by time and the unforgiving salt of the ocean, bore the weight of experiences most would never know. Yet his eyes, though shadowed with the years, held a glint of something deeper, an old soldier's resolve, a strength that never fully left. Nearby, under a tall willow tree, sat his daughter Catherine, her laughter ringing through the air like the sweet chime of a bell. She had just turned 20, but the youthful joy in her voice made her seem much younger. Around her, two of her closest friends, Amara and Leora, sat cross-legged on a faded quilt, the remnants of an afternoon picnic scattered around them, empty soda cans, an untouched birthday cake, and half-eaten sandwiches. The warmth of the day and the soft breeze seemed to wrap them in a bubble of contentment, far away from the worries of the world. Catherine's smile was radiant, the kind that lit up the entire beach. Her hair, a dark cascade of waves, shimmered in the late afternoon sunlight. The bond between her and her friends was undeniable, more like sisters than friends, having shared memories since childhood. They had come to the beach to celebrate, to escape the noise of the city, and to bask in the simplicity of life. The distant cries of seagulls echoed overhead, their wings slicing through the fading blue sky. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore was the perfect background, like a lullaby for the soul. The world seemed suspended in time, as if nothing could ever disturb the delicate balance of this moment. The sun, now dipping lower in the sky, cast long shadows across the sand, turning the shoreline into a living painting of gold and amber. Frank, standing at the edge of the pier, took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the scene before him. For a brief moment, everything was right. His daughter, his girls, Amara and Leora, were laughing, carefree, untouched by the harshness of life. They didn't know it yet, but this peaceful evening was about to be shattered. The sound of a distant engine, faint at first, began to cut through the serenity like a blade through silk. Frank paused, his senses sharpening. He turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes, the familiar instincts of a man who had lived through battles awakening deep within him. The hum of the motorcycle engines grew louder, the noise now impossible to ignore. Catherine and her friends didn't hear it, their voices blending with the crash of the waves. But Frank felt it, something stirring in the pit of his stomach, a warning, a memory. He turned away from the view and walked back to the picnic area, where the girls were still laughing, oblivious to the approaching storm. His footsteps were quiet but deliberate, each step adding to the tension that slowly built around them, unseen. The engines grew louder still, now unmistakable. Frank's hand, almost instinctively, found the worn handle of the fishing rod resting nearby. He paused, his eyes narrowing once more as the unmistakable sound of engines came closer, much closer now. He felt a tightness in his chest, a familiar feeling of caution, as if something was about to break the fragile peace. And then, there they were. The roar of motorcycles, 6 in total, broke through the quiet beach like an explosion. The thud of tires on sand replaced the soft rhythm of waves, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of their approach. The gang of bikers screeched to a halt, their engines echoing off the cliffs in a violent symphony of aggression. Frank, sensing the change in the air, turned sharply toward the intruders, his back straightening, muscles tensing. But it wasn't just the noise that startled him, it was the look in Katrin's eyes as she stopped mid-laugh and stared at the approaching group of bikers. Her smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing her face. The two girls beside her, Amara and Leora, were already standing, the weight of the situation sinking in. The bikers were a stark contrast to the peaceful surroundings. They were dressed in leather jackets and tattoos, their faces hardened and unforgiving. The leader, a towering man with a skull patch across his vest, took a long look at Katrin and her friends, a cruel grin spreading across his face. He dismounted with a swagger, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. The others followed, laughing, their presence as invasive as the roar of their bikes. Frank, standing a few yards away, felt the cold rise of tension in the pit of his stomach. This was not the life he had chosen, not the peace he had worked so hard to build. And yet he knew that the moment had come, the one he had hoped would never arrive, the moment when the past, the skills and the strength he had left behind would once again be called upon. As the leader of the gang made a beeline for Katrin and her friends, Frank's fingers curled tighter around the rod. In the air, the scent of salt water and danger mixed, and Frank knew this would be no ordinary confrontation. The calm of the ocean seemed far away now, replaced by a storm that was about to unfold. But Frank wasn't always this way. Once he was a soldier, a man of action, a man who had witnessed the horrors of war, who had faced death more times than he cared to count. Before the waves and the peaceful sunsets, before the fishing rod and the quiet life by the sea, Frank was a man hardened by battle. He was a man who had learned that survival wasn't just about skill, it was about resolve. A man who had been tested in ways most could never imagine. But there was one thing that kept him going, one thing that gave him a reason to keep fighting, even after the war had ended. Her name was Amanda, his high school sweetheart, the girl who had always believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. They had planned a life together, a simple life, far away from the horrors of war. It wasn't a life filled with grandeur or fame. It was a life of small moments. Morning coffee shared in the quiet of their home, walks on the beach, fishing by the pier. It was the life Frank had dreamed of, and for a while it seemed like everything was perfect. But the storm that had raged inside him was only quiet, not gone, and Amanda was the one who had to bear the weight of it. The cancer came swiftly, quietly, stealing Amanda away piece by piece. It wasn't the war that had claimed her life. It wasn't the violence or the bloodshed. No, it was something far crueler, the slow, merciless disease that took the woman he loved with a terrible finality. Frank did everything he could to fight it, just as he had fought in battle. But there was no weapon that could stop cancer, no bullet that could pierce its grip. And so he watched her fade, helpless, as the days passed and her strength withered. The man who had been a warrior on the battlefield was powerless against the slow march of illness. She passed away in the quiet of the night, with only the sound of the ocean to witness her departure. Frank was left alone, alone with the ghosts of his past, alone with the empty house that had once been filled with the warmth of love and laughter. After Amanda's death, Frank retreated further into solitude. He took up fishing, retreating to the shore to find solace in the rhythmic crash of the waves. The sea, with its vastness and its eternity, felt like a safe place, an escape from the noise of the world. But the noise in Frank's mind never stopped. The war, the loss of Amanda, they never left him. And so when Frank finally sought peace in the small town by the sea, he had no desire for conflict. He wanted nothing more than a quiet life, to fish, to remember his lost love, and to protect his daughter, Katrin, who was now all he had left. Today was different. Today was a day for celebration. The sky stretched endlessly, a canvas painted with the soft hues of late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting a warm, golden light over the beach. Katrin, the light of Frank's life, was turning 20. Her laughter rang out like music, blending with the sound of gentle waves brushing against the shore. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. While Katrin and her friends were engrossed in their celebration, while Frank allowed himself to believe just for a moment that this peace could last forever, something else was stirring. Something unseen. Something uninvited. Beyond the beach, past the dunes where the sand turned to gravel, the faint rumble of engines broke the quiet, low, guttural, and growing louder with each passing second. A sound out of place in this serene haven. Frank stiffened, his body reacting before his mind could process. Years of training, years of war, had honed his instincts. He turned his head slightly, listening. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Motorcycles, a group of them. His hand instinctively went to his side, where his sidearm had once been during the war, but there was nothing there now, just the weight of his responsibility as a father. He glanced at Catherine, her laughter still filling the air, oblivious to the unease that now gripped him. The roar of motorcycle engines sliced through the peaceful air, a sound so jarring it seemed to vibrate through the sand itself. Seagulls scattered in a flurry of feathers and cries, their serene calls replaced by the guttural growl of machines. On the horizon, they appeared. 6 riders, tearing down the gravel path toward the beach, their presence as unwelcome as a storm on a sunny day. At the forefront was Drax, a towering man whose silhouette alone seemed to radiate intimidation. His leather vest bore the emblem of a skull wreathed in flames, a symbol that promised trouble to anyone who crossed him. Behind him, the other riders followed, their machines growling like restless predators. The tranquility of the afternoon was shattered, replaced with a tension so thick it could choke the air. The gang rolled onto the sand, their tires leaving jagged tracks in the soft ground. Engines idled, spitting and sputtering like wild beasts held on a leash. The leader, Drax, killed the rumble of his machine with a deliberate twist of his wrist. He swung his leg off the bike, his heavy boots landing on the sand with a dull thud. His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the group before him. The 2 young women frozen in surprise, the older man who was clearly their protector, and Catherine, whose expression flickered between confusion and growing unease. Drax smirked, his scarred face twisting into something cruel. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice carrying a mockery that immediately set Frank's nerves alight. He spread his arms, as if inviting them to share the joke. "A little beachside party? You didn't invite us. I'm offended." Frank stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between the bikers and the girls. "We're not looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady but firm. Drax laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "Trouble?" he echoed, taking a step closer. "Old man, I am trouble." Amara and Leora huddled closer to Catherine, their laughter replaced by silence, their earlier joy now a distant memory. Drax's eyes landed on Catherine, and his smirk widened. "Birthday girl, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. 20, and already you've got these boys fighting over you." His gaze flicked to Frank. "Except him. What's he going to do? Tell me a war story?" Drax grabbed a bottle of lemonade from the picnic blanket and upended it into the sand, the golden liquid seeping into the ground. "Oops," he said, with mock innocence. "Clumsy me." His gang laughed, their voices a chorus of menace. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms, reached for the basket of food, pulling out a loaf of bread and tearing into it with exaggerated relish. Frank's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He had promised himself, promised Amanda, that he would never let his temper get the better of him again. But the sight of these men invading their peace, taunting his daughter, and mocking everything he had fought to preserve, it was almost too much to bear. Drax turned his attention back to Frank, his tone dripping with disdain. "Look at you, just an old man with a bad back and a dead past. What's the plan, huh? Gonna yell at us? Shake your cane?" The gang erupted into laughter, their amusement echoing across the empty beach. "Leave," Frank said, his words cutting through their laughter like a blade. For a moment Drax paused, his smirk faltering as he looked at the older man. But then he laughed again, louder this time, throwing his head back. "Or what?" he sneered, his face inches from Frank's now. "What are you going to do, old man?" The girls watched, fear etched into their faces. Catherine reached out, her voice trembling as she called to her father. "Dad, don't," Catherine whispered, her words laced with worry. But Frank didn't move. His eyes, steely and unyielding, remained locked on Drax. In that moment the calm fisherman was gone, replaced by the man he had once been, the soldier, the fighter, the protector. The tension reached a boiling point. Drax leaned back, his smirk returning as he gestured to his gang. All right, boys, looks like the old man's got some fight left in him. Let's see how long it lasts. The gang began to spread out, their boots crunching on the sand as they surrounded the small group. Frank's heart pounded in his chest, but his expression didn't waver. He had faced worse odds before. But this time, it wasn't just his life on the line, it was Caitrin's too. The air grew heavy, charged with a silent anticipation. Frank, standing firm, surveyed the circle forming around him and the girls. His mind worked quickly, instinctively calculating distances, reading body language. Years of training honed in combat had never left him, even in the quiet life he had chosen by the sea. Frank raised a hand, his palm out in a gesture of calm but commanding authority. "I'm telling you, walk away now," he said, his voice steady but with a cutting edge that left no room for doubt. "You don't want this." For a moment, the bikers hesitated. There was something in his tone that gave even Drax pause, but the leader's ego wouldn't allow it. Drax laughed, a sharp bark of derision. "Listen to him, boys," he jeered. "Grandpa thinks he's still in the army." He turned back to Frank, stepping closer until they were only inches apart. "You're all bark, old man, no bite." The mocking laughter of the gang echoed around them, but Frank's expression didn't change. His jaw tightened, his fists flexing at his sides. Caitrin, Amara, and Leora clung to each other, their faces pale, watching helplessly as the situation spiraled out of control. Frank's warning came once more, his voice low and deadly. "This is your last chance." But Drax, emboldened by the jeering of his gang, sneered and reached out, shoving Frank backward with a heavy hand to his chest. The shove barely moved Frank, but it was enough to ignite the fire he had been holding back. Frank moved like a coiled spring, his hands snapping up to grab Drax's wrist in an iron grip. Before the leader could react, Frank twisted, using the man's momentum to pull him off balance. In one fluid motion, Drax's massive frame was sent sprawling into the sand with a force that knocked the wind out of him. The gang froze in stunned silence as their leader lay gasping on the ground. Frank stood over him, his stance solid, his presence commanding. "I warned you," Frank said, his voice calm but laced with a steel that sent a shiver through the group. Drax scrambled to his feet, his face red with fury and humiliation. He lunged at Frank, his fist swinging wildly, but Frank countered with precision, his fist driving into Drax's gut, doubling him over. A swift kick to the back of his knee sent the leader crashing down once more. The bikers, jolted out of their shock, began to close in. They outnumbered him 6-1, but Frank didn't falter. He had faced worse odds before. The fight escalates. The first biker charged, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his arms. He swung a chain, its links whistling through the air, but Frank ducked, closing the distance between them before the man could recover. Grabbing the chain, Frank yanked it free with a force that sent the biker stumbling. He spun the chain once, then struck, wrapping it around the man's legs and sending him sprawling into the sand. The gang begins to attack in earnest, but Frank's skill and experience keep him one step ahead. Another came at him from behind, a burly man with fists like sledgehammers. Frank turned at the last moment, deflecting the punch with a forearm block and driving his elbow into the man's ribs. The thug grunted in pain, staggering backward as Frank delivered a swift uppercut that sent him crashing to the ground. The fight is intense, chaotic, and gripping. Two bikers attacked at once, one swinging a tire iron while the other lunged with a knife. Frank dodged the swing, the tire iron whistling past his ear, and stepped into the path of the knife wielder. Grabbing the man's wrist, Frank twisted, forcing him to drop the blade, then drove his knee into the biker's chest, sending him reeling. The tire iron came again, but Frank caught it mid-swing, wrenching it from the biker's grip and using it to disarm him with a single blow. Drax watches from the ground, his face a mix of rage and fear as Frank methodically dismantles his gang. The tide of the fight turned quickly, the bikers realizing too late that they had underestimated their opponent. One by one, they fell, their bravado stripped away by Frank's unmatched skill. The once cocky gang now lay in the sand, groaning and defeated. There was a moment of silence. The sound of the waves started returning as the bikers struggled to their feet. Frank stood among them, breathing steady, his gaze unwavering. He turned to Drax, who was still on his knees, clutching his ribs. "Now," Frank said, his voice like a blade, "get off this beach and don't come back." The gang scrambles to leave, their swagger replaced by shame. But as Drax retreats, he throws one last look over his shoulder, a glint of defiance still in his eyes. The bikers mounted their bikes and roared away, their departure a pale echo of the chaos they had brought. But as the sound faded, Frank's eyes remained on the horizon, his instincts telling him this wasn't over. The sound of the motorcycles grew faint, swallowed by the endless expanse of the sea. Frank turned to Katrin and her friends, his steely gaze softening as he saw their pale faces. They stood frozen, their picnic scattered, the laughter and joy of the birthday celebration a distant memory. Katrin stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Dad, are you okay?" Her eyes searched his face, looking for signs of the man she thought she knew, the father who had always been her safe haven. But today she had seen another side of him, a side forged in battle and honed by hardship. Frank's hands unclenched, the tension in his body easing as he turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "I'm fine, Katrin," he said, resting a hand on her shoulder. "But I need you all to pack up. Let's head back to the house." The girls nodded, quickly gathering their things, but their hands trembled. Frank glanced around the beach, his sharp eyes scanning the area, the instincts of a soldier still alive within him. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The little house by the sea, usually a sanctuary of peace, felt different now. The air was heavy, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. Frank stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, while Katrin and her friends huddled in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. The setting sun painted the walls with hues of gold and crimson, but Frank saw none of it. His mind replayed the events of the afternoon, analyzing every detail, every threat. He knew men like Drax. They wouldn't let this humiliation go unanswered. The tension is interrupted by a faint sound in the distance, the low, rumbling growl of motorcycle engines. It's far off, but unmistakable. Frank's head snapped up, his body going rigid. The sound grew louder, a chorus of menace echoing across the water. Katrin appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, they're coming back, aren't they?" Night had fallen, and with it came the bikers. Their headlights pierced the darkness as they approached the house, their engines roaring like a storm. This time there were more of them. Reinforcements called in by Drax. Their numbers doubled. Frank moved with purpose, his calm demeanor masking the storm within. He ushered Katrin and the girls to a back room, his voice steady but commanding. "Stay here," he told them. "Lock the door and don't come out unless I tell you it's safe." Katrin hesitated, her hand clutching his arm. "Dad, you can't face them alone," she whispered. But Frank shook his head. "This is my fight, Katrin. Trust me." He stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. The bikers were lined up in front of the house, their engines idling, their faces shadowed but their intent unmistakable. Drax dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, a cruel grin playing on his lips. "Round 2, old man," Drax called out, his voice dripping with malice. "Let's see if you're still as tough without the element of surprise." Frank stood his ground, the ocean wind tugging at his shirt. He had no weapons, no backup, just his wits and years of experience. Drax gestured to his men, and 2 bikers stepped forward, their chains glinting in the moonlight. Frank remained still, watching, waiting. He let them come to him, their overconfidence their greatest weakness. The first swung his chain, the links slicing through the air, but Frank sidestepped smoothly, his hand shooting out to grab the chain. With a quick twist, he yanked it free, spinning it in a deadly arc before striking the man across the chest. The biker stumbled back, clutching his ribs, as the second lunged with a knife. Frank ducked under the blade, delivering a sharp kick to the man's knee. As the biker fell, Frank disarmed him, tossing the knife into the sand. The others hesitated, their bravado faltering as they saw their comrades incapacitated. But Drax wasn't done. He barked orders, sending more men into the fray. The battle raged on, Frank holding his ground against impossible odds. But as he fought, a shadow moved in the distance, unnoticed by both him and the gang. A figure stepped out of the darkness, watching, waiting. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the last biker fell and the gang retreated, Frank turned toward the house, his body battered but unbroken. But somewhere in the night, a new enemy was watching, plotting. Frank's fight was far from over. The morning sun rose sluggishly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the little house by the sea. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the echoes of last night's confrontation still fresh in everyone's minds. Frank sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, his gaze distant. Katrin stood by the counter, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Leora and Amara, too scared to leave, lingered nearby. Their normally bright spirits dimmed. They spoke in whispers, their words hushed as though afraid to break the fragile silence. Frank hadn't slept. While the others rested fitfully, he had kept watch, his senses sharp, his instincts honed from years of experience. The faint bruises on his knuckles and the ache in his back were reminders of the battle, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the shadowy figure he had glimpsed just before the bikers retreated. He hadn't mentioned it to Katrin or her friends. They had already been through enough. But Frank knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Drax might have been humiliated, but men like him didn't let things go easily. And whoever that figure in the shadows was, they were a new and unpredictable threat. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching into eternity. By midday, the tension had become unbearable. Katrin tried to distract herself, baking a cake with Leora and Amara. The kitchen filled with the sweet aroma of vanilla, a small comfort in the midst of uncertainty. But even this momentary peace was shattered. A knock at the door, a sharp, deliberate sound, cut through the air like a blade. Frank froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on the table. Katrin glanced at him, her eyes wide. "Dad?" she whispered. Frank didn't answer. He motioned for the girls to stay back as he approached the door. The door creaked open to reveal a man in his mid-40s, dressed sharply in a black leather jacket, his face partially obscured by sunglasses. He wasn't one of the bikers from last night, but his presence carried the same weight of danger. Frank studied him carefully, noting the small tattoo on his wrist, a symbol Frank recognized from his military days. "Frank Rourke," the man said, his voice calm but with an edge that suggested he wasn't there for a social call. "We need to talk." Frank didn't move, his expression unreadable. "About what?" he replied evenly. The man's lips curved into a faint smirk. "About what you did last night. You've made some powerful enemies." "You see," the man continued, his tone casual but laced with menace, "Drax isn't the kind to take a beating lying down. And neither am I. My name's Garrett, and let's just say I'm here to settle the score." Frank didn't flinch, his years of training suppressing any outward reaction. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "If Drax sent you to scare me, he's wasting his time." Garrett chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. "Oh, I'm not here to scare you, Frank. I'm here to warn you. Walk away now, and maybe we'll let you and your family live in peace." But Frank wasn't one to be intimidated. He leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto Garrett's. "You've got it wrong," he said quietly. "This is my home, my family. I'm not the one who should be walking away." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken threats. Garrett's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You've got guts, old man," Garrett said, stepping back toward the door. "But guts only get you so far. You've started something you can't finish." With that, he left, his boots echoing on the wooden porch as he disappeared into the distance. But his words lingered, a dark promise of what was to come. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Frank stood by the window once more, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The ocean was calm, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny beacons of hope. But Frank's mind was elsewhere, anticipating the storm he knew was coming. In the distance, the faint rumble of motorcycles echoed once again, growing louder with each passing second. Frank's grip tightened on the edge of the windowsill. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his daughter, for her future, and for the peace they had worked so hard to find.